Good afternoon. I'm Mike Hearn, Curator in charge of the Asian Art Department here at the Metropolitan Museum. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Art of Dissent in 17th Century Chinese Art, the Zhilelo collection of masterpieces from the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. This is one of a number of special exhibitions that you can now see in our Asian galleries. So I hope that in the course of the rest of this afternoon and in the days to come, you will take advantage of all the activities that we are engaged in to celebrate Asian art. I think that is one of the most significant things about being at the Met, that it is an encyclopedic collection, and Asia, which is really spans all of time and half the world, is a vast area and one that clearly we need to understand better and to put into a historical context. So in our Japanese galleries, we have a sensitivity to the seasons, celebrating summer and fall. In the Indian galleries on the third floor, we have a small show called Mother India, celebrating images of the goddess in Indian art. We have a marvelous exhibition in the Korean galleries called Precious Patchwork. It is cloths that have been patchworked together in Korean tradition, but as comparisons, we have an American quilt, we have some Islamic pieces, we have European pieces as well. Finally, we have, coming up at the end of this month, we have an extraordinary lone exhibition of nearly 200 Indian paintings, both Islamic and Hindu works of art that were organized by the Rietberg Museum, but our own John Guy has augmented that exhibition, has changed the selection, and it's beautifully installed in our special exhibition galleries on the south side of the building, opening just towards the end of this month. So there's a great deal to see in addition to the Art of Dissent, and I should mention on the third floor, the Chinese Decorative Arts Galleries, just above the Art of Dissent, we have red and black Chinese lacquer of the 13th to the 16th century. So we have an enormous range of materials for you to enjoy this afternoon and in the days ahead. The current exhibition was formed by Mr. He Yaoguang, a private collector who lived in Hong Kong. His life was nearly 100 years long. He was born in 1907 and died in 2006. So he witnessed the Second World War, the Communist Revolution, and I think seared by those extraordinary traumatic moments, when he started collecting in the 1950s in Hong Kong, his focus became works of art by men whom he esteemed as having high moral values. And I think it's no accident, therefore, that he came to focus on the period, the transition from the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty. The Ming actually came to an end in 1644 when Chinese rebels occupied the capital and the last Ming emperor committed suicide. He hung himself on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City. And following that traumatic event, the Manchus, people, semi-nomadic people who lived north of the Great Wall in what we used to call Manchuria, now Liaoning, were invited through the gates of the Great Wall to help subdue the rebels, and they simply didn't leave. They instead continued to march southward, and over the course of the next several decades, they subdued Ming pretenders who occupied various capitals in the south along the coast, ending down in Guangdong in the far southwest. So it was really 1662 before the Ming dynasty's last claimant was vanquished. And during this period, many men who had served under the Ming dynasty felt compelled to either martyr themselves in resistance movements against the Manchus or to withdraw from civil service, as any good Confucian gentleman should. You cannot serve under two dynasties. So when the Manchus imposed their rule, established the Qing dynasty, many men of conscience withdrew into the landscape. They often became Buddhist monks, both as a way to disguise their identity and also to withhold support for the new regime. So in that way, you might say that the art of dissent is really about a kind of passive resistance, a kind of withholding of support as an act of conscience and as a way of resisting the newcomers. So the way I've organized the exhibition is divided into 8 galleries, and instead of following the sequence in the catalog, I've tried to organize it thematically. The first room is devoted to a group of men who consciously martyred themselves in opposition to the Manchus. These 3 works of art are hanging on one wall in that first gallery, and they represent men who, in the case of Ni Yuanlu on the far left, the age of 41, after the last Ming emperor committed suicide, he followed the emperor's example, killing himself while serving in office as a high official in 1644. Wang Daozhou joined a resistance movement, was captured in a military engagement, and died in jail. And finally, Wang Siren starved himself rather than live under the Manchus. He was 71 at the time. And so you get this span of ages from 41 to 71, and that also gives you a sense of how these men used calligraphy as a way of expressing their individuality. The young man, Ni Yuanlu, versus the older man, generation older, Wang Siren, I think epitomized the differences in calligraphic styles from the older to the newer generation. Wang Siren was very much influenced by the late Ming calligrapher Dong Zhichang. So his writing is very fluid, it's very elegant. You have these very suave lines, beautiful ligatures, connecting strokes. There's an elegance and fluidity to the writing that's quite beautiful. Look at Ni Yuanlu's by comparison. There are all these angular turns, bunched up strokes. There's something eccentric, something very awkward, and that kind of assertive independence, I think, really gives you a sense of this man's personality, someone who is willing to kill himself in the name of his loyalty to the Ming, had this very distinct, strong personality. Now, He Yaoguang was actually from Guangdong province, and one of the remarkable things about the exhibition is the focus in his collecting on men who lived in Guangdong. So we're talking about Guangzhou, Canton area, and Guanglu was one such man. So actually one of the later galleries, 1.5 galleries, is devoted to art from Guangdong province, and Guanglu was, again, a man who martyred himself. The city of Guangzhou was actually conquered twice. The first time there was a massacre. The city was captured in 1647. The general commanding those invading forces switched sides, restored the capital, and again Manchu forces arrived early 1649, and after a 10-month siege, Guangzhou fell again. And this man ultimately committed suicide by starving himself while surrounded by his antique zithers. So a wonderful sense of this man's scholarly attachment. He was young. He was only 46 years old. And we have 2 striking examples of his calligraphy. The one on the left was actually written in 1645 as he prepared to travel north to the city of Nanjing, which was still in name the secondary capital of the Ming dynasty. He never arrived. The capital fell to the Manchus before he got there. But you have a sense of this dramatic, exuberant writing that he's full of confidence that he would be able to somehow single-handedly change the course of history. Probably very little time later, he wrote this very poignant poem. I'll read it to you. 芙蓉叶兰不换香，吴越宣烟向带霜。梦入花田看月女，秀琴淡丽以谢阳 says that the leaves of the Furong here is lotus. The leaves of the lotus have already started to wither before I returned home, clearly returning home from Nanjing. He said in the 5th month, so we're talking about high summer, there's still frost clinging to the mountaintops. In Guangdong, that would be very rare, an inauspicious sign, no doubt. He says, in my dreams, I entered a flowery field and I saw a girl from Yue while holding in my hands red lychees while watching the sun set. So the last half of the poem, the girl from Yue is Shi, who by seducing the leader of Wu saved her native Yue from being captured by the Wu armies. So a virtuous female who sacrificed herself for the cause, while the second allusion to the red lychees is to Yang Guifei, the courtesan who was the consort of Ming Emperor, the Tang Emperor Xuanzong, who lost his ability to rule, govern wisely by being distracted by this woman who used this special express mail, the Pony Express of the day, to bring lychees from Canton up to the capital city of Xi'an. So here he is, he feels like he's aiding and abetting the fall of the dynasty, even holding on to these lychees. So you have a sense of how the poetry became infused with imagery that was redolent of this sense of self-flagellation and disappointment. Now, the painting of the period is largely landscape, and landscape painting, I think, became a kind of emblematic way of retreating from the dusty world of politics into the more pristine world that would survive even as China was desecrated by the Manchus. But even before 1644, landscape was an important vehicle for self-expression. This is Huang Daozhou's calligraphy again, and his painting, which is in the middle of the first room. And in it you see two very tall pine trees that almost embrace one another. It was painted for a friend, a disciple, and we see how this one tree wraps its boughs around the straight arrow trunk of the second pine tree. It's painted 10 years before the fall of the Ming. There's no clue at this point that the Ming dynasty is about to topple. Huang Daozhou, in fact, was an avid critic of the Ming government. He was conscientiously remonstrating with the court to change its policies. This gives you a sense of how two men would have a bond of friendship that was also embedded with a moral dimension. The pine tree was a symbol of longevity, survival, and moral rectitude. But it was after the fall of the Ming when we see landscape become an extraordinary vehicle for self-expression, with a whole school of art that matured in the 17th century in Anhui province. The leading artist of that school was Hong Ren. Hong Ren's family suffered during the Ming fall, and he abdicated from the world by becoming a Buddhist monk, took on the name Hong Ren. And you see in these two works in the exhibition how landscape for him was a very personal statement, personal kind of metaphor. I point out that in both examples there are these intertwined pine trees. So clearly these paintings, in this case it was a birthday painting, we don't know who the recipient was here, but the idea of these conjoined pine trees is, I think, symbolic of two like-minded men, the artist and the recipient of the painting, and how that bond was shared. The style of the paintings is also quite significant. Hong Ren took as one of his sources of inspiration the actual landscape of Anhui province, in particular the rugged scenery of Mount Huangshan, or Yellow Mountain, which has these striking peaks with pine trees often growing right out of the side of the granite cliff faces. The other source that's being evoked here is none other than the 14th century master Nizan. Nizan lived during the Mongol occupation of China, so he too was forced to flee his home, to be uprooted by the chaos at the end of the Yuan dynasty, and for the last 20 years of his life he lived in a houseboat, he fled, and he painted virtually the same landscape over and over again. Very spare, austere imagery of trees against the distant mountains. And these kinds of trees with these very simple conventions for leaves, for foliage, typical of Nizan style. So I think it's very clear that some of the angular qualities of the rockwork, some of these hatch marks, the absence, the general playing down of ink wash, all attributes of Nizan style that are coming forward in this new guise representing Huangshan. And you can see that this style actually had tremendous impact across the art of a number of artists in the exhibition. This is Dai Banxiao. Dai Banxiao actually witnessed his father die after having been mortally wounded in a battle with the Manchus. So he was a lifelong loyalist to the Ming, and he too adopted this dry brush, acerbic style, very spare, lacks rich ink washes altogether. And you can see that this empty pavilion, the thatched hut here, becomes a kind of reference to Nizan, the wintry trees with no foliage at all, this extraordinarily contorted landscape, very almost impenetrable, and the recluse's home up in the cliffside, almost inaccessible. Joshua Biao, another Anhui painter who ultimately migrated to Yangzhou, which became one of the great commercial centers of the empire in the later 17th and 18th century. He too adopts the style of Nizan quite clearly. You see the spare trees with a similar kind of very bare, hardly any foliage left. And there's the typical Nizan empty pavilion, the symbol of the house or the lifestyle that had to be abandoned during this period of chaos. Just down the Yangtze River from Anhui is Nanjing. Nanjing was the secondary capital of the Ming. It was actually the only capital when the Ming dynasty was founded in 1368 after the fall of the Mongols. And it was given this tremendously imposing city wall, which is still there, some 27 miles in circumference. It was a great metropolis. But in 1402, the Yongle Emperor usurped the throne, moved the capital to Beijing, and the primary capital for the Ming remained in Beijing in the north, but Nanjing retained the status of a secondary capital with a kind of secondary Ming imperial government in place. And Gongxian was one of the men who lived in Nanjing. He was first and foremost a poet, but he also became a painter. He supported himself through painting as well as his poetry. And it's that merging of poetry, painting, and calligraphy that is so distinctive of this period. The scholars who use poetry to express their feelings and to embed added layers of meaning into the landscape. So this one is, I think, particularly poignant and, I believe, quite revealing of his sentiment of loyalty. It was painted in 1671, and it reads, 绿柳新蒲夜水宽，人家太谢迎竹兰。送春归去，来壶酒，细朝南绳，余气寒。So the green willows and the newly sprouted cattails spread out across this wilderness of water. And at someone's home where the buildings stand, there are red-colored railings that are reflected in the water. And as he sends off the spring, he says, even when I drink liquor, drinking wine, it's hard to diffuse the cold chill that comes at sunset. Powerful enough as poetry, but when you read between the lines, the Ming dynasty, the word Ming means bright, brilliant. Here we have a setting sun. The royal family's surname was Zhu. The character means crimson or red. So he's talking about a reflection of the red railings in the water. So the Ming dynasty, the light is ebbing. The glory of the Ming is a reflection of what it once was. It's an enormously poignant evocation of something that was lost. especially in Nanjing, I think you have these feelings. Another Nanjing painter who was first and foremost a poet was Zhang Feng. Beautifully atmospheric suggestion of landscape with a little village embedded in the trees here, a lone figure of a fisherman. He talks about the light of the day occluded by the shadows above the cliffs, the clouds. Talks about the darkness covering the moss, a lone figure in a rain cape, so it's rainy, dark weather, walking along the river, while a white heron looks back and forth for fish. There's no bird in the landscape. And yet this sense of searching, the sense of being dislocated, of loss, of being lost, is very much part of the atmosphere. Now, Nanjing was also the center of the capital of Jiangsu province, the wealthiest, best educated population in the empire, and was a frequently visited by aspiring young men who had no deep attachment to the Ming and who aspired to make their way in the civil service exams. And so there was also a very active school of painters in Nanjing that painted landscapes that were almost like tourist albums. They evoked Nanjing scenery. This is actually a small painting. It's only about 6 inches by 8 inches. It's part of an album of 8 images, and it shows you how poetry and painting were conjoined by this artist. Gao Jian came from Suzhou, but I'm positive he must have been working in Nanjing. So this is evoking a poetic line from Tao Yuanming. Tao Yuanming, or Tao Qian, was a 4th century poet who left office after only 83 days. He said, I can't take it anymore. So there's a condemnation of government corruption, and he rusticated himself. He lived at his home, growing enough grain to support his love of poetry and wine. And one of his most famous poems is really an escapist image of a fisherman who follows a trail of peach blossoms into a grotto. And he comes out on the other side and he finds a paradise that had been lost to time, a lost horizon. They knew nothing of the changes of dynasties that had taken place. So it was an image of a place that was secure from the trauma, the turmoil of dynastic change. He continues with, it's actually, the 8 leaves chronicle the 4 seasons as well. So a lovely image of he talks about the late summer with the grass and trees flourishing and the wind moving through the trees. It's a marvelous example of how probably Nanjing artists were also influenced by Western painting. You have this very persuasive ground plane receding to a low horizon line, maybe even a tint of the setting sun tinging the mountains red or crimson. And he talks about the lotus blossoms that are now turning to lotus pods, the leaves are withering. And finally, a winterscape where the protagonist, Yuan An, refuses help even though he's snowed in. So there is this subtle current of, if not resistance, at least the escapism and isolation that inhabits this poetic painting as well. Now, not all painting and not all landscape was influenced by the Ming fall. So it's not fair to say that landscape painting universally reflected the concept of escapism. This is 6 panels from a 12-panel set painted by the professional artist Lan Ying, who was working in Hangzhou in Zhejiang province, the old Song capital. And it's a commercial work. He was a professional painter. It's done on gold paper, so it's a very colorful, large-scale screen. It starts with springtime, moves into the summer, autumn, and finally winterscapes. Here's the Nizan style, but in fact, what he's done in each of these is he's named a specific artist that he's emulating. This becomes a template by the end of the 17th century, when the Kangxi emperor has secured the empire, when the Ming loyalists have been adequately actually celebrated by the Kangxi emperor rather than chased down. You see a movement away from landscape as an expression of deep-set melancholy feelings towards this more intellectual approach to landscape, depicting different ancient styles. This is a kind of orthodox canon is being set up. Lan Ying's paintings are not very well rooted in actual models, but he's paying lip service to that tradition. The striking thing is, this was not painted in 1690. It was painted 6 years after the fall of the Ming in 1650. So we see that this idea of painting landscape as a vehicle for showing off one's knowledge of the past is still quite, was already in place early on. One of the two artists who was most deeply affected by the fall of the Ming was Zhu Da, or Bada Shanren, who was a Ming prince. He was from Jiangxi, and he was a descendant of the Ming royal family, and his art remains seared by the experience of the loss of the Ming throughout his career. Here he is painting this extraordinarily cryptic, unusually highly personal image of a fish. We see how the fish's tail has been trimmed by the composition. It's kind of lopsided in the way it's placed in the composition, and there is this eye that looks up as if there was something ominously hanging over the head of the fish. There's a psychological dimension here that's really unsettling and typical of Bada's oeuvre. But what is also fascinating to me is that he too became influenced by this idea that grew up towards the end of the 17th century of painting a spectrum of landscape styles that reflected one's command of the ancient masters. What is fascinating, however, is that Bada's painting remains so personal and so recognizably his own. He was certainly not into imitation. I love the fact that these trees are growing upside down. There's a little figure in the pavilion here, but this bold ink wash style is probably evoking a 11th or 12th century painting style, Mi Fu, or his son Mi Yoren, most likely. Then he can switch gears and do this more dry brush style with these very characteristic rounded boulders, maybe an evocation of Huang Rongwang. Again, we see the pavilion here. This may be an evocation of Li Cheng, 10th century master whose level distance with these tall foreground pine trees are absolutely characteristic. Here, the pine tree seems to be reaching out towards that lone pavilion, and in the distance, we have this receding mountain going out towards the distant mountains. Oftentimes, these distant mountains are an emblem of paradise, but paradise that is inaccessible, paradise lost. So here, those distant mountains are reduced to a few cursory brushstrokes, almost an illusion, as you see these naked trees, again, probably an evocation of Nizan. Another Nizan-style image, this low embankments with tall trees, but no distant mountains whatever. His commentary is also, I think, quite revealing. He talks about Guoxi and Guoxi's cloud-topped mountains. He talks about Dong Yuan, a 10th century artist who lived himself through the fall of the Southern Tang dynasty, and his brush style of hemp fiber strokes that he used even in trees. And he says, I'd really like to have seen what the people of the time, how they interpreted Dong Yuan's painting. And then he mentions Yi Feng Huan, or Hai Xie Song Shanhe, Huang Gongwang, lived in the 14th century, the end of the Yuan dynasty. But according to Bada, he still painted the landscape, the mountains and the rivers of the Song dynasty. In other words, he was a loyalist, even 70 years, 80 years after the fall of the Song. So here again, we see this proclivity towards referencing the past in a way that is keyed to loyalist sentiments. And then he uses this very cryptic symbols to date the painting. None of these artists referred to the reign period that would have identified them as serving under the Qing. Every emperor named his reign period when he came to the throne. Kangxi Emperor was called that because it was the Kangxi reign period, Qianlong reign period, Yongzheng. None of these artists refer to those Qing reign titles. They use only cyclical dates, another sign of their loyal resistance. Now, topography was a significant type of art that was being developed in Suzhou, in particular, in the 15th and 16th century. And this artist, Huang Xiangjian, used topographic paintings to recount his own narrative of being a filial son. Actually, he was a rotten kid. His parents were stationed in far-off Yunnan, and in 1652, 8 years after the fall of the Ming dynasty, he finally said, I wonder what's happened to my parents. I haven't gotten any letters. So he takes it upon himself to travel 700 miles in search of his parents, and he recounts this adventure in painting as well as in his text. So here he is in Guizhou, anchored for the night in this beautiful little town, the mountains in the distance, traveling by river through Hunan, and then entering the mountains. These mountains will remind you of Guilin. He talks about mountains that look like bamboo sprouts, amazingly exaggerated landscapes of this pass with the thundering waterfall. And then this one gives you absolutely vertigo trying to steal it. But every leaf you can find him, there he is coming out of the clouds down this mountain slope. And finally he arrives in Yunnan, in a place very close to Lijiang, which is now home for the sort of minority peoples very close to Tibet. Presumably his parents are here. Here he is. There's no warm embrace is the culmination of this. It's all about the landscape, but it does give you a sense of how landscape could be used in this exaggerated way to convey the sense of the arduous journey. I want to end with the other great Ming prince who lived through the fall of the Ming dynasty, and that's Shi Tao. Shi Tao was only 3 years old when his family was actually massacred, not by the Manchus, but by a contending Ming pretender to the throne. And he entered the Buddhist church. He disguised his identity that way for a good deal of his life. And his whole life was one of trials and tribulations, you could say bitterness, and it's conveyed very beautifully and humorously by this album leaf. It's one of 4 depictions of vegetables and fruit that's in the exhibition. He says, 这个苦瓜老饕就吃了一生. He said, this bitter melon, old Tao, that's himself, old wave, Shi Tao means stone wave, has been eating this his whole life. So the Chinese have an expression, 吃苦, to eat bitterness is to endure difficulty, to survive. And then he goes on quite humorously, actually, to describe that it's been wind and rain for the last 10 days, so he burned some incense, he had some bitter tea, and then he took out these 4 sheets of paper from the court and used those to paint these images. And then he sort of is peddling them all. He says, can you imagine how hard it is to have gotten these pieces of paper? So I wonder who's going to be lucky enough to own them. So he was a bit of a self-promoter as well, but when he turned to really the serious work of producing a commission for an important collector patron, we see something of Shi Tao's amazing versatility as an artist. There's an album, 22 leaves, that is featured in the exhibition, and it really demonstrates the virtuosity of this man. There's maybe echoes of other painting styles there, but what is so striking to me is the enormous originality of his painting. This one is a depiction of Lushan, and so we do see this in other works by Shi Tao, this sort of massive square mountain. So he was familiar with some of these landscapes. It was actually commissioned by a young man who was himself a poet and describing these scenes. We see these larger-than-life boats coming down. There was complete disregard for the logic of recession. Compositional treatment was always in the service of beautiful compositions and bold calligraphy, always very different through each of these. So dry brushwork juxtaposed with wet, inky paintings, beautiful coloristic treatments. Here he is. This is the Nine Dragon Rapids near Chongqing in Sichuan. Here he is, a sailboat coming up the Fuchun Mountains with perhaps the Nizan-like angler's terrace. I love this one with the way in which the sky is completely filled with the bold calligraphy that matches the inky qualities of the landscape. Beautiful sense of recession as he leads us up the slope to a mountain pass. Hengshan, the great southern peak, Mount Luofu in Guangdong province. So we're traveling all over southern China here. This is a peak in Fujian, which the poem describes climbing the peak and looking out while the sun rises. It's a great Chinese custom of looking at the sunrise from the heights. Here's a tomb of the concubine of Su Dongpo, a great 11th century poet, a farewell party in Guangdong. And finally, this image, which is the image we've used as the evocative logo, if you will, of the exhibition itself. The inscription talks about sailing amongst the Milky Way with the immortals. So it's a kind of general idea of travel in this vast expanse. But one can see how one can interpret these images in a way that may also reflect something of the personality of the man himself. We're looking at the stern of a ship. Its sails, perhaps made of wood, would be natural to tint it that way, or are we seeing the last rays of the Ming dynasty tinting this sail that rouged color, sailing across this boundless ocean fraught with mist and clouds towards these receding, almost an illusionistic, almost a mirage, like distant mountains. It gives you a sense of the artist's own sense of a lifetime of traveling, a lifetime of seeking, and never really being completely at home, never really being moored. So that, I think, gives you a sense of the richness of this period and how remarkably the collection reflects something of China during this time of transition, and how landscape became a poignant and very personal form of reflection. Thank you. It's now a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jonathan Hay, who was educated at London's School of Oriental and African Studies, later at the Chinese Academy, Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and finally at Yale, where he did his dissertation on this master, Shutao. Jonathan is really one of the most versatile and imaginative scholars working in our field. He has written extensively across a broad spectrum of the scholarly dimension of painting. He's written on Song landscape paintings. He's composed works on wall paintings of the early Yuan dynasty, figure paintings of Zhao Mengfu, Wen Zheming, the great 16th century landscapist in Suzhou, the Yangzhou eccentric artist Luo Ping, painting and printing and publishing in Shanghai in the 19th century, and he's even written his interview with Bryce Marden, current New York City artist. His first major book was his dissertation topic. It's called Shutao, Painting and Modernity in Early Qing China. It's a book-length study of this very seminal artist, one of the protean figures in 17th century art. And most recently, he's published another wonderful book called Sensuous Surfaces, the Decorative Object in Early Modern China. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Hay.
Thank you for coming. The fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 was experienced by most educated Chinese as a collective and personal trauma. Confucian education inculcated in each individual from childhood the idea that he or she had a family relation to the nation. The suicide by hanging of the last Ming emperor in 1644, therefore, was equivalent to the death of a father. This image of a suicide by hanging by an artist whom I'll discuss later was created in 1645. Although it does not directly represent the emperor's death, no one at the time could have mistaken the indirect reference. Now, the Ming Dynasty fell to Chinese rebels, but the rebels immediately fell in turn to the Manchus. So the fall of the dynasty also meant the loss of the nation. From 1644 on, the Manchus ruled China as the Qing dynasty, even though their authority was contested for more than 30 years. In Chinese, the loss of the nation and the fall of the dynasty were both framed as deaths. For many, this double trauma was equivalent to the trauma ensuing on the violent deaths of one's parents. In dealing with the trauma, Chinese society and individuals looked initially to the ritual response of mourning. On the individual level, just as they did after the deaths of their parents, sons in particular withdrew from normal professional and social responsibilities. Men who thought of themselves as remnant subjects of the Ming suspended their normal lives, entering a kind of limbo. The language of the time described this limbo in spatial terms as the wilderness. Wilderness was a very broad concept that in more peaceful times simply referred to the space of withdrawal from political life, alienation from political life, as in the case of Taoyuan Ming, described by Mike Hearn earlier on. It was a move into internal exile, exile within one's own country. But after the fall of a dynasty, wilderness took on an added and more immediate layer of meaning as a space of mourning. Some men entered wilderness limbo by becoming Buddhist monks or Taoist priests. Some became rootless wanderers. Others became hermits and closed their doors to the world. In family life, after the deaths of one's parents, the mourning period lasted for a set period of time, after which the son was expected to rejoin normal life. But there were no such regulations governing mourning for a fallen dynasty. Some men never rejoined normal life. Some men killed themselves. Others rejoined the normal life of society quite quickly. Most waited many years before doing so. Complicating the situation further was a second frame of reference. Anyone who had been born under the Ming dynasty had the possibility, and some would have said the responsibility, to continue considering himself to be a Ming subject, or herself too, in the most Confucian families. The perception of responsibility in this regard was particularly high for anyone who had served as a Ming government official. One Confucian ideal, which Mike Hearn mentioned before, held that the dynastic subject could not serve two masters. Having been an official of the Ming dynasty, or even having taken the official examinations under the Ming dynasty, one had the responsibility, after the dynasty's fall, never to seek office again. However, there also existed a second, more pragmatic Confucian ideal. When the nation had been lost to foreign invaders, it could be acceptable, after a significant period of mourning, for an individual to go to work for the new dynasty in order to defend Chinese culture from a position at the center of power. Men who took this second path were said to have left the wilderness, to have left it behind them. Those who did not, those who took the first path and stayed in their wilderness limbo, these obsessive mourners often came to construe themselves as ghosts. They were Ming subjects in the absence of a Ming nation. The world they inhabited physically was a Qing world, but mentally they inhabited a parallel world that was like a shadow of the original Ming world into which they had been born. And you're looking at it here. The painting by Hongren on the right was painted in 1664. The work by Gongxian on the left was painted a little later in 1671. Hongren is a Buddhist monk's name. The artist became a monk after the fall of the Ming dynasty. Gongxian did no such thing, but he did give up any attempt to pass the official examinations. I'm sure you've already noticed that there are no figures in either painting. Neither of these artists included figures in his other paintings either. In 17th century Chinese thinking, or in one kind of 17th century Chinese thinking, ghosts were not normally visible to living people, but of course they could be seen by other ghosts. You will also have noticed that Gongxian's painting has no color at all. In fact, Gongxian underlines the absence of color by referring insistently to it in his inscription. Green willows, new reeds, and wilderness waters that open out beyond. From the terrace of someone's home, the reflection of a red-painted balustrade. After sending spring back to where it came from, I still call for wine, but the sight of the setting sun is not enough to dispel the chill brought on by the rain. Color here exists only in memory and in a Qing world that Gongxian refuses to inhabit. The wilderness for Gongxian is an austere, melancholy place. Hongren's painting, on the other hand, even though it depicts a place that is cut off from the world, you can see that the mountains go all the way across the painting, and they seem to cut off the space on this side of the mountains from the world beyond. That was a pictorial trope that had been invented in the 14th century, around the time of the fall of the Ming dynasty, and was taken up again by Hongren in the 17th century. So his painting depicts a place that's cut off from the world, but it does have a little muted color, a very, very little. There is a reason for this. It's a birthday painting. Even ghosts apparently had birthdays and wished each other long life on such occasions. The recipient of this painting may not himself have been a close friend of Hongren, but he was a close friend of one of Hongren's relatives. The artist has symbolized the friendship in the two interlocking pines in the foreground. Hongren, the Buddhist monk, presented this painting to an acquaintance who was a Buddhist layman. A stone pillar in his friend's courtyard, you can see just here, a little stupa, is of a kind that would often have been inscribed with Buddhist texts. Now, have you noticed the stairs, the stone stairs behind the house? They lead the eye and the mind up to the top of the mountain, where there is a flat terrace. In his inscription, the artist associates this terrace with not Buddhist, but Taoist practices, the kind of alchemical practices that were often invoked as metaphors for longevity. The very, very pale pink color in the painting, just very little of it in a few places and now much faded, is as far as this wilderness artist could go to evoke the strong red color of the cinnabar that think of seal paste for Chinese seals. The strong red color of the cinnabar that Taoist alchemists used in their pursuit of immortality, and which the artist refers to in his poem. Now, the two paintings with which I've begun are typical of an enormous production of wilderness paintings by countless artists during the 60 or so years following the fall of the Ming dynasty. You will see, or you have already seen, many of them in the exhibition. They are austere, often devoid of color, devoid of figures, devoid of any unambiguous celebration of life, and melancholy, if not desolate, in their mood. You're much more likely to see autumnal or wintry scenes than you are to see springtime scenes. And when you do see springtime scenes, I think this may be one, it certainly doesn't look very spring-like. Most of these paintings were executed in South China. Hongren was active in the city of Nanjing, was active in southern Anhui province, and Gongxian was active in the city of Nanjing, the southern capital of the Ming dynasty. The very first wilderness paintings of this austere kind date from 1644. They were produced within just months of the last emperor's death. The last paintings of this type date from the first decade of the 18th century, about one 60-year cycle of years later. Now, just to situate you, for those of you who are not familiar with Chinese geography, and I can't see this very well, so this is southern Anhui province here. This is Mount Huang. Right? The city of Nanjing is a little ways to the north on the Yangtze River, and we're shortly going to be concerned not just with Nanjing, but with the city of Yangzhou, and later on I'm going to take you on a journey down south. But we'll start with Nanjing. Now, as it happens, the exhibition includes one work that belongs to the beginning of wilderness painting. It's a wonderful 12-leaf album with very, very small leaves, just 6 inches high, roughly, 6 or maybe 8 inches high. This work is not overall austere at all. It has lots of color, and it shows that there was no single pictorial language for responding to the fall of the Ming or for evoking the wilderness. And this was especially true at the very beginning of wilderness painting, the wilderness painting of Ming remnant subjects. It took some time for a standard language to develop. This album was painted in Nanjing shortly after the city fell to the Manchus in 1645. The artist's name is Xiao Yuncong, and before I discuss his album, which as you can see is rather peaceful, I want to tell you that he is the same artist who depicted the suicide by hanging. Not only that, but he depicted the suicide in that same year of 1645. So we're dealing with two sides of one artist's art, and we have to keep them in mind when we look at either one. We have to keep the other one in mind when you get the point. Now, the image, the suicide image, is one of a large series that he designed for a book of illustrations to a poem dating from the 4th century BC, when China was not yet unified and states were continuously warring with each other. The original poem evoked a world of chaos and violence in one of those states, the state of Chu in South China. It's not a coincidence that Xiao Yuncong was a southern artist and that he looked back to the history of South China. And it's clear that his illustrations were meant as indirect evocations of the horrors of war and civil war in his own time, and also of the uncertainty of the future in 1645. Because in that year, no one knew whether the Qing dynasty would survive for another 10 years, never mind more than 250 years. So we need to bear in mind the explicit violence of these illustrations as we look at the calm landscape images of the album. What do we see in its 12 leaves? Well, I've rearranged the leaves thematically. I feel free to do this because most 17th century albums have been remounted, sometimes more than once, and they tend to, in the process of remounting, they often lose their original sequence. And this album is certainly out of order because the final leaf is now leaf 2. So I've rearranged the album's the leaves thematically, and I'm going to say that one of the things that we see, let me talk about this first, is escape into the past, and almost in a literal sense. Let's consider the painting on the left, this wonderful mountainscape, crowded with mountains, which evokes Song Dynasty painting. The inscription says, Li Long Mian, that's Li Gonglin, late 11th century artist, has a composition entitled 10,000 Mountains Without End. So mountain after mountain after mountain. I've imitated it using a small sheet of paper. And I've also taken refuge among its spectacular sights. So here we have a Song-style painting, but it's the style of the Song dynasty filtered through the style of a mid-Ming dynasty, early 16th century artist, Ming, one of the most influential Suzhou masters, and one of Xiao Yunsong's great influences. Now, in the inscription to the leaf on the right, he again evokes the Song dynasty, and he again evokes Ming, but this time textually. And he claims in the inscription that Ming, his own most obvious model in painting, had based his style on landscape paintings by a man named Wen Tong. We know Wen Tong today as one of the great bamboo painters of Chinese history, but there are literary references to works of other kinds. And so Xiao Yunsong, whether for good reason or for his own personal idiosyncratic reasons, has chosen to believe that Ming's very careful style was based on lost works by Wen Tong. And the scene that we see is indeed evocative of a certain kind of naturalistic Song dynasty painting or 10th, 11th century painting, a style particularly associated with South China, Dongyuan, Juran come to mind. When we look into these paintings to see figures, we will find them. I'm sure you've been looking for them, if you've noticed them. He has taken refuge in the spectacular sights of this mountainscape. This is an image of Xiao Yunsong himself by what he says in his inscription. But there's also a little fella down here who's coming to visit him. So you've got some basic notion of community. These remnant subjects, these people who were loyalists often in a political sense as well to the Ming dynasty, did think of themselves as a community set apart from society at large. The other painting, though, doesn't have obvious figures. I mean, there must be figures in the boat, but it's so far away. That's not a figure on the bridge. Down here, there's a house, but we don't know who's in there. The painting on the right evokes an even earlier period in the history of Chinese painting, the Tang Dynasty. the rather awkward-looking rocks and the combination of strong colors, blues, greens, and reds, take us back to that very early period. Again, we don't see any figures, and I don't know if you've noticed, but the house, let me take you, the house almost seems to be hiding. And it's very, we have to work very hard to see in the window. The painting on the left, a wintry landscape. This one could evoke a number of different periods, and it evokes partly the Ming dynasty, the Wenzhou Ming style of painting, but more important in this context, certainly from a symbolic point of view, is that it is reminiscent of late compositions of a type that were very common in the 10th century, a very bloody time when China was divided up into many different dynasties and kingdoms. And when lake landscapes developed where you had you would have a foreground with a single tree or just a few trees, and then across the water you would see a mountain, often against one side, against one edge. And that particular pictorial composition was taken up in the 14th century by artists like Zhixin and others at the time when especially at the time when the Yuan dynasty was falling apart, to express their alienation from the Mongol state, but also their sense of dislocation at a time of civil war. There are figures here. There are two over here talking to each other, conversing, and then one in a boat off on his own. And one last image of this kind, where we see again in a painting that evokes a northern Song painting, these massive mountains with the carefully delineated surfaces, little figure in a boat, and a temple. There's the gate to the temple. One's led to think that this is a man who has taken refuge there. Temples were common hideaways for remnant subjects at this time. So what we've seen up to now are scenes of exile, scenes of internal exile. Now, other paintings in the album seem less concerned with the past, but are equally concerned with withdrawal and escape. On the left, we see two men who have gone to look at a cave. And in this period, you can't look at a cave without thinking of the Peach Blossom Spring, which you saw earlier, seen from outside. There's the cave, and then the scene on the other side, this utopian place that was the kind of emblem of escape. Then we see a couple of leaves where the artist seems to be depicting a journey to, or a movement toward the edge of things. On the left, you'll see you see a cart being pushed up to the side of the river. These are the masts of boats. We don't know what the scene is. Is this a boat being loaded because somebody is leaving, trying to find a safer place to live? Or, on the contrary, has a boat arrived in a safe place and it's now being unloaded? And on the right, a single figure who's making his way up to some scenic site, a little pavilion, with what seems to be a rock. even poring over this painting in the exhibition, I couldn't quite work out what it was, but I think it's one of those weirdly shaped rocks. And although it's not clear to us where he could, what he could see from there, it may refer to a specific site in the Nanjing area. And that would tell us its deeper meaning. But even like this, you can see that it's a lonely image. It's an image of somebody going to a place where he can be on his own. And it's not a happy image at all. And then something over here, something similar is happening in this image where we see a man coming over a rise toward the gate of what is perhaps a temple. It looks as if it ought to be a temple. These old, barren trees, aged trees, you see them over here as well, symbols of endurance. The viewpoint is very striking. We see it from a point that's aligned with the temple, and we're led to ask ourselves, is he coming home, or is he coming to visit someone who is, a friend who is already in the temple? The left-hand leaf is in a more classic mid-Ming, Wenzhong Ming style, and it shows us a hermitage. The gate is open, but we don't see who's there. Has he gone out on a walk? Is he inside? Has he left the gate open for people to come? But in any event, an image of somebody in reclusion. And finally, the last two leaves. Up to now, we have no clear sense of specific geographic place, but in the leaf on the right, the mountain is clearly identified as Mount Qixia, just outside Nanjing. The inscription is written in an archaic seal script, and there he recalls his youth when he had pursued his studies for the examinations at Mount Qixia. The leaf is a memorial to the end of his ambitions to be a government official. In the foreground, you see these great ancient pines that have seen human ambitions come and go, and which have perhaps seen dynasties come and go. And then finally on the left, we come to the leaf that probably closed the album when it was first created. The artist gives the day, the month, the cyclical year, and his home of the moment where he had completed the album. What is the image? Two trees on a rock outcrop, one a willow bent over almost as if weeping, the other a bold, upright, flourishing tree with crimson leaves. Crimson, Zhu, was pronounced the same way as the family name of the Ming imperial family, also Zhu. So here what we have is an ambiguous statement combining mourning and a kind of loyalist defiance. Using his normal, colorful, archaistic pictorial language, Xiao Yunsong, in 1645, responded to the trauma of the fall of the Ming in a way that is all the more powerful for being understated. During my last 10 minutes, I want to take you through a second album, though not in its entirety. It has far too many leaves. This album was painted at the very beginning of the 18th century, almost 60 years after the fall of the Ming. The artist is someone whom we know today under his Buddhist name, Shutao, but he was born in 1642 under the name of Zhu Ruoji in Guilin. He was, in fact, a minor Ming prince who sought refuge in Buddhist monasteries as a very young boy. By the time he reached adulthood, Shutao's princely identity was an open secret, but he did become a rather serious monk and eventually became a Chan master, a Zen master. He was not a loyalist artist in the same sense as the others we have been considering so far. However, when he was in his mid-50s, he decided to leave the Buddhist monk community and become a professional painter. professional artist. From that point on, he gradually embraced the role of the wilderness artist as well, and by the time of his death in 1707, he was routinely making reference to the fall of the Ming in his paintings and poems. In the process, he also became a celebrity, a living remnant of the Ming dynasty, a celebrity for a younger generation of men who had grown up under the Qing. One of these younger men was named Huang You. He is one of the men seated around the table in this painting. Huang became obsessed with the final generation of Ming remnant subjects and with the events around the fall of the Ming dynasty. He was a great traveler. He went all over China, and when he got back from his travels in 1701, he asked Chih to illustrate the poems he had written during his journey. One of the poems recorded the gathering that you see here, which actually took place in the city of Yangzhou on the eve of Huang's departure on his journey. So, Yangzhou up here. Many of the leaves in the album rather straightforwardly depict some striking sight from the journey, as imagined by Chih on the basis of the poem, since for the most part he had not seen these places himself. A few he had, but many he had not. And this is the case, for example, for the leaf you're looking at, where Huang You on his boat has just turned a bend in the river and suddenly sees the city of Changshan in front of him. Changshan is down here. It's also true for this depiction of one of the peaks of Mount Luofu in Guangdong province, down in the south. Mount Luofu down here. And for this wonderful depiction of Hainan Island, as seen from the island from the mainland, with a boat setting off in its direction. So there's Hainan down here. But these are not the leaves I want to discuss. Instead, I want to highlight the leaves that have a relation to the fall of the Ming dynasty. This leaf, for example, which depicts the Western Terrace up here. One of two natural terraces, natural stone terraces, overlooking the Fuchun River southwest of the city of Hangzhou. So now we're quite near to his starting point, and this is the Fuchun River, it's down here. This was one of the most sacred loyalist sites in all of China. It was there that remnant subjects of the Song dynasty held a memorial service for their hero Wen Tianxiang after his execution by the Mongols in 1283. And Huang's poem that's inscribed here was inspired by these events. These events which dated from the time of an earlier loss of the nation to a foreign power. Huang You writes, "Ever since the sorrowful song arrived in the direction of the south, these empty mountains have seemed to be filled with the sound of weeping." From there, Huang continued south down the river system to the area of Longyou, which you see here represented as an idyllic place, a bit like paradise on the other side of the peach blossom spring. You'll find Longyou on the map, just beside the Fuchun River. But both the artist and the traveler would have been well aware that this had been a war zone in the mid-1670s, when the Qing dynasty was preparing to eliminate the final military resistance to it. One of the key battles in that campaign took place just a little to the south in 1676, and it was a battle for control of this mountain pass, which connected Jiangxi province with Fujian province. Let me show you where it is. It's this pass here. It was a crucial strategic site because it was in Fujian province that Ming forces were based, and then later rebel forces in the 1670s. Huang You writes, "In talk and laughter, one should also find a place for danger. Whose are these regrets that fill the map's empty spaces?" Now, once he got into Fujian, Huang was traveling through more than one chapter of Loyalist history. Fujian had been a base for Sung Loyalist resistance in the late 13th century and for Ming resistance continuously from 1644 to 1662, and then again for Chinese resistance to the Qing in not exactly Ming Loyalist resistance in the early 1670s. Huang ends his poem here by making an indirect reference to the sad history of the region. "How could I bear to come back here again? Here and there, nightjars call from spring woods." Nightjars? It won't mean anything to most of you. The nightjar was not originally a Loyalist symbol, but it became one in the late 17th century. It was said to shed bloody tears, and its call sounded like "Buru Gui Chu," which can be understood to mean "better go home." So, for example, one Loyalist poet at the time wrote, "Returning home, I can hardly believe that the talking nightingale has changed into a nightjar, bitterly weeping for the loss of the nation." Still further south, near Guangzhou, so now we're all the way down here. This is the Pearl River estuary here. Huang visited a pavilion that looks out over the estuary. Just downriver of here was where the Song Navy fought its last great battle with the Mongols in 1279. 400 years later, the estuary was an important theater of Ming resistance operations against the Manchus. After crossing over to Hainan Island, all the way down at the bottom, Huang made his way back north by a different route. And here we see him on the river between Hangzhou and Yongzhou in Hunan province. And that means we're up here. Hangzhou was another center of uprising against the Manchus in the 1670s, as Huang You well knew. But the river was also well known to the artist. Shutao adds a note here that he had traveled through this area in 1657 going south, and he may also have traveled through it going north as a toddler in the mid-1640s, a Ming prince then being saved from certain death by a loyal family servant. Traveling east, Huang passed through Jiangxi province and visited Mount Lu, which we here see from a distance. The theme of his poem is hermits, and though he mentions only hermits from the distant past, we happen to know that just before visiting the mountain, he paid a visit to Bada in the nearby city of Nanchang, which was very closely associated with Mount Lu. Bada, like Shutao, was a Ming prince, and Huang You may well have had Bada in mind when he wrote about Jiangxi hermits in the inscription. Huang's final stop, as represented in the album, and my final stop in this lecture, was in Nanjing. Nanjing, back up here, under its Qing name of Jiangning. Nanjing was my geographic starting point in this lecture. In Nanjing, the former Ming southern capital, he visited a man named Cheng Jing'e, who was a famous loyalist figure and the friend of both Bada and Shutao. It's Cheng Jing'e's home that he is depicted here as an icon of unwavering reclusion in the wilderness. As you can see, the image is governed by a symmetry centered on the house, alone in the wilderness, alone in the landscape. Behind the house are three hills, the tallest one in the middle. In front, the river bank, or the river course on one side, is balanced out by a bridge on the other, both being echoed in turn by the oblique walls of the house. The building has a clear, if approximate, diamond shape, roughly centered in the composition too, and it has been further intensified as a motif by its whiteness, by the halo of bamboos, and by a sharp, straight tree cutting vertically through its center. There are the bamboos. These elements are balanced, of course, by just as many others that distract our attention from the artifice, but these are the ones that consecrate the house as a strikingly stable site charged with energy. The house of a remnant subject of the Ming dynasty has been turned into a monument to the fallen dynasty, like an ancient tree or a stone stele. We've seen several such houses during this talk, though not all were given the same monumentality as this one, almost 60 years after 1644. All these houses are located in the wilderness, in that metaphoric space, and they are all inhabited by men who at times thought of themselves as ghosts, whose unfortunate destiny was to have lived on into the afterlife of the Ming dynasty, where they were fully visible only to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that sensitive reading of the landscape. And I think of the mindset of those people who dwelled in the wilderness that was the post-Ming world. This afternoon we will conclude with a panel discussion or conversation between Jonathan Hay and myself, and also two other distinguished speakers who have worked on China and have lived through much of its turmoil as well. Orville Schell, who originally planned to join us today, was unfortunately called away to Beijing on short notice, and he is unable to be here. But in his stead, I'm very grateful to my colleague Jason Zhixin, who is Curator of Chinese Art here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who will join us in his stead. Jason is no stranger to turmoil, having lived through the Cultural Revolution. He was actually the first part of the first class of college students to graduate from university in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, when it was enormously competitive to actually get into school. There were very few schools that were open, and 10 years of students who had deferred their education before that time. So, and Jason took the unusual direction of studying English language and literature. He actually taught English at both the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing and Chinese Normal University before being accepted as a graduate student in Princeton, where he created a wonderful dissertation on the jade culture of the Neolithic Liangzhu culture centered around Hangzhou and Nanjing, the very area we are treating so carefully today. Jason, since coming to the Met in 1999, has been deeply involved in planning some of the major exhibitions that the Met has engaged in bringing here from China. First, China, Dawn of a Golden Age, which focused on the period after the Han Dynasty and into the height of the Tang Dynasty, from the 3rd to the 8th century, and most recently with the World of Kublai Khan, the great show devoted to the Yuan Dynasty, another era in which China was actually subjected to the turmoil of conquest by the Mongols. And so Jason's many articles and research have also enriched those two exhibitions and many others to which he's contributed symposia papers and articles. Finally, I would like to, it's a great honor to welcome to the Metropolitan Museum Jonathan Spence. I think Jonathan is probably well known to everyone in this auditorium as one of the leading experts on Chinese history in the world today. He was educated at Clare College in Cambridge and then at Yale, where he completed a dissertation in 1965. And since that time, he has been a prolific writer, creating more than 15 books during his career as a professor at Yale, where he was the Sterling Professor of History for many, many years now. He holds that position as an emeritus. I first studied Professor Spence's work when I was a graduate student myself, working on the Kangxi Emperor's Southern Inspection Tours. He wrote a very important book devoted to Cao Yin, the bondservant of the Kangxi Emperor. One of his most engaging works at that time that I enjoyed so much was called Emperor of China, Self-Portrait of Kangxi, written as if it was in the first person. The difficulty of changing China, whether you're a martyr or a Westerner, is something that he treats in To Change China, Western Advisors in China, 1620 to 1960. The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci is another great book that he's produced, and Return to Dragon Mountain, Memories of a Late Ming Man, certainly touches on this same era. But of course, perhaps the book that best defines Professor Spence's contribution is called The Search for Modern China, which is really a core text of virtual mandatory reading for anyone who wants to study Chinese history of the last several hundred years. So it's a great pleasure to welcome both Jason Swin and Jonathan Spence to join us here with Jonathan Hay. Do you remember where you're seated? Good. So we've both had a chance to talk, and you two have had to and listen to us. So I wonder if, Jonathan, you would like to reflect on what we've been saying and maybe offer some comments about this general period that we've been examining.
Okay, I'll try. This is a breathtaking subject to me, and strangely enough, when I came from England to the United States and switched to Chinese studies, it was actually this period that fascinated me the most. I think it was that period from somewhere around the 1630s, 1640s, up to about 1700. And Kangxi, the extraordinary emperor who reigned for 61 years, represented the Manchu conquest of the Chinese, in a sense, but also the building of new kinds of bridges, and the employment of large numbers of Chinese in the Qing dynasty's own bureaucracies. So it was a sort of model of incorporation after a period of great suffering and difficulty. It's a huge topic done in the round. And I would like to mention Frederick Wakeman's book called The Great Enterprise. If any of you really want to get into this, a close friend of mine, alas, not with us anymore, but he wrote this remarkable double volume on this whole period of what was going on, or trying to work out what was going on at multiple levels in the 17th century. So with some of what I'll be saying is drawn from Fred Wakeman's own incredible research, I think. We haven't really talked about many other aspects. We could maybe see what comes naturally out of discussion. But certainly, one of the conundrums of this whole period, of however you define it in the 17th century, is how one defines this sort of the chronological spread of this conquest. I noticed that Dr. Hearn mentioned several decades were taken with the conquest. You sort of emphasized it with your voice in a rhetorical way. And it is true, but how can a conquest take several decades? And how do we decide when it starts, where it matures, where it goes on to? How can we either limit or sort of make boundaries around this one slice of Chinese history that produced such extraordinary art? I can't emphasize that enough. We've maybe been too cautious here with our art historian experts. But it was a wonderful period. And by the way, it was a great period in novels and fiction and all kinds of decorative arts and the drama and in poetry and epic poetry. And some people have pointed out that countries seem to do their best in times of greatest travail. I don't know if you accept that, but something about living in crisis also stimulates, I think, art and activism in the whole community. So I wouldn't, I don't know how I'd answer my own kind of examination question on when was the Qing conquest of the Ming. Somewhere between the 1620s and the 1690s. That's already pretty huge, about 70 years. You could easily go back another 20 years, even further than that, back into the 16th century period. And you could take the settlement of China under its new rulers and its new dynasty as being somewhere around 1720. So we can actually say the conquest took from 1620 to 1720. And that would include all kinds of consolidation within China itself and all kinds of other aspects of governance and this multiple rule, a kind of a bi-ethnic kind of rule of Manchus and Chinese, but also with Mongols and even Westerners, including members of the Jesuit order who were in China at this time and actually worked as Catholic missionaries. They also had jobs with the imperial palace complex, teaching them, among other things, cloisonné ware and various kinds of perspective. I was going to say that in some of the last images that Professor Hay showed, it seemed to me that there was very much a definite kind of Western influence in the perspective, and I think you'd mentioned that very briefly yourself. Scholars have again looked at this, what influence was coming in on the West as well as just from the Manchus or the Chinese themselves. Well, that's just some thoughts. Another thought would be these wonderful artists and creative people and men able to carry through with such courage this new transition to their country. They're doing it in the name of the Ming. And if we stand back a little bit as historians, we would have the thought, I believe, that the Ming was a terrible dynasty. So if you actually give up everything, you kill yourself, and in many cases even take the family with you. For instance, people who committed suicide by burning themselves in their homes with their families. You are speaking as a passionate loyalist, but you're speaking on behalf of a regime that was crooked as anything, and cruel, and incompetent, and steadily shrinking as its inept generals lost chunks of land. You could draw a really melancholy picture, and so the point becomes kind of a double loyalty. Why are you saluting with your life the image of just the idea of a dynasty, or are you somehow linking that to something we could call the Ming family, which had been the Empress of China ever since 1368, a huge, long-lived dynasty. I don't know if people want to return to that in discussion, but it is a mystery here. What exactly are we mourning? And how terrible does a regime have to be for us not to mourn it anymore? And lastly, I was struck as a young student all that time ago by the amount of suicide. To me, suicide seems a kind of a desperate, passionate, anguished kind of thing. It fills me with kind of respect as well as depression. But this was a period, apparently, of suicide in many different parts of China. And many of these artists were continuing their creative life sort of while memorizing their dead comrades. And it's powerful to read from different angles. Sometimes the later successors under the Qing dynasty, they would almost mock their friends in memory. But others would just grieve, and in their little shrine in your house or your brother's house, you would be memorializing maybe 20 members of the family who took their own lives. And I'd been startled by this when I started looking at this period of history. I never imagined that was possible. I still find it a mystery. And maybe because you ended that way in introducing Zhixin, maybe there's a kind of leap into a period like Cultural Revolution, when violence just gets out of control. Those who survive it do so joyfully, but they're very conscious of all the comrades who've perished on the way and their own family. So I'd emphasize the enormity of the topic to me, the fact that 50 years after coming across it, I'm still fascinated by it, and I still think there's lots to say about it and the most wonderful art to use as we try and make that analysis.
It will be interesting. Thank you, Dr. Spence, for bringing Zhixin into this conversation, because it was also going through my head as you were speaking. Was there a similar kind of attachment to the Republic of China when the Communist Revolution occurred, and right down through the Cultural Revolution, with the kind of turmoil and violence that engendered? Were there suicides? What was the motivating force for that? How did we compare the contemporary, the 20th century revolutionary transformations of China with what took place in the Ming times, when there was clearly a corrupt and incompetent government, which the Kuomintang, the nationalists, have also been accused of being both?
Yeah.
So, Zhixin, do you see any parallels, or in your own experiences, how do you react to that?
Well, this is a very interesting topic. I think that a lot of people have done their work on it, especially about comparison between the two regimes, like the Chinese government today and the Kuomintang's government before. And when you see the change in 1949, it was not quite a dynastic change, because it's not one dynasty replaced the other. It's rather two different ideals. They have different ideas, especially nowadays, actually. If you see the recent publications in China, now they have a totally different view. You might call it a revisionist view of the recent past, or the recent history. It's now seeing that the one side is, for all the right principle, the other side is complete corrupt for all bad things. But now they rather view people who have different ideas, have different aims, or in a kind of conflict. I think this is one of the things. But in terms of art in that particular period of time, one of the things I think it may not be closely related to this show, but it certainly has a certain, I would say, significance or relevance to this. It's a small exhibition right across the street. On the other side is called the Bloom in the
Blooming in the Shadows.
Blooming in the Shadow. And
in China Institute.
It's
right
in
now.
China Institute, which is a group of artists who were at the time started really as amateurs, because at the time in the late 1970s or in the middle of 1970s, there was no school. The 10 years of Cultural Revolution simply shut down everything. But these were the people who really had a great passion for art. They wanted very much to learn about art, to study it by themselves. So they organized, it's almost like an underground group or club. And they had very little access at the time to any kind of resources, like models or picture books. But they were able, if they had this passion, they had this really great enthusiasm, so they managed to teach themselves. And they had this little exhibition, almost secret exhibition in one person's house. That shows us, one of the things that could have happened in a very tightly controlled environment.
Would you consider that art to be in any way subversive or a kind of protest against the existing status quo? Was art used in that way in this case?
I don't think that people at the time, I happen to know some of these people, because they are pretty much my generation. And it was not really open protest, or not, they were not really trying to work against the government, but they wanted to pursue something which were not available, which were not really openly allowed at the time. And you may describe this as some kind of art. I wouldn't call it a movement. It's really activity among like-minded people. But at the same time, the effect that they had is to demonstrate the freedom of spirit cannot really be shut down by any kind of a political system.
The New York Times published the photograph that we've seen several times of the painting of the fish by Bada Shanren. In the Holland Carter's review, the picture editor didn't realize that the inscription on top is a much later addition to that painting, but it was actually quite striking to me to think about that juxtaposition because the inscription was written by Qing Daoren, Li Ruiqing. Li Ruiqing was the teacher of Zhang Daqian, who's well known to many of us as an important conduit for Chinese art to the West, and also a great admirer of Shitao and Bada, both these artists. But Li Ruiqing's inscription made it clear that he was a Manchu loyalist. He signs himself Qing Daoren, the Taoist of the Qing, and he refers to our former dynasty, and he raises the name of Emperor Gaozong, Qianlong, above the rest of the line as a mark of respect. So it's very clear that he too was a loyalist. I don't know of any Qing loyalist that committed suicide when the Republic was created, but it was very striking. This inscription was written in 1918, so just 7 years after the Republic was, after the Qing dynasty was vanquished. So you do get this recurring pattern of evoking the past and men who decided to make a stand and identify themselves with the vanquished dynasty right down to the 20th century.
Well, in that case, I mean, there's a slightly different issue there because these are people, in some cases in the modern period, using the act of suicide as a way of focusing attention on the government, but they're not so much mourning their own fate. They're trying to get the conscience of the country to see that this is so desperate that we must act. And studies now are beginning to be done on this more. You know, some of the tragedies of the late Qing, and that's 1900 to 1911 period. There were a good many youthful suicides of young students and so on trying to draw their plight, you know, the knowledge of China's plight to a global work, and willing to sacrifice their lives for it. But nothing like this scale, and nothing, I don't think, like the same, you might say, suicide as a form of mourning at the end of the Republican government. There were some cases, indeed, and probably many more later on during the Cultural Revolution. It seems to be that some people simply couldn't bear it anymore. But so now we're returning perhaps to a kind of equilibrium where at least more people can get a good education and more people can now study the paintings in the clear, and of course they can use all the resources of the internet and the mass communication to get a sort of global knowledge. And so maybe that's the last generation to be so stuck without the images being available.
I don't think I would see suicide as a form of mourning, actually. And certainly in the 17th century, I would see it actually as a form of political action. Back then, in the same way you're describing, trying to uphold a certain idea of moral values, trying to provide a model for resistance. I mean, the people who mourned were the people who didn't want to die. I see suicide as one form of political action. Another form of political action, of course, is armed resistance. But in a museum, we're concerned with art, and the art that gets produced is, after 1644, is really a stand-in for political action. It's a symbolic compensation. And I think that's important to bear in mind. You know, at the minute you start painting about this, that means that you're not out there picking up a spear and trying to attack Qing troops. So in that context, I find it useful to make a distinction between the authority of the Qing and the legitimacy of the Qing. I think the people who contested the authority of the Qing were the ones who killed themselves or picked up weapons and, joined the resistance. The painters that we're dealing with, for the most part, are the ones who contested the legitimacy of the Qing, but acknowledged its effective authority, and endured it. And what they did was, in their painting, was to try and bring into view the gap between authority and legitimacy, to keep that as an open gap. It's a kind of utopian thing to do, And their enduring effort to keep that gap open is really very, very admirable. It seems to me. I mean, it can be more difficult to keep on living than to not.
I was wondering, I mean, there's so many sides to this, but an aspect we haven't really looked at all is that of family. And the role of wives in this system, and also the role of children, particularly when the fathers make very different judgments, maybe in the late 1640s, 1650s, that resistance is now no longer valuable. It might please you in some way, but it's not really helping anybody. And so you can find all sorts of cases in late Ming and early Qing literature in which fathers essentially make the decision to allow their children to take the examination. And there's a continuity for those of us who are so impressed by the Chinese levels of education here, even in the dark days of the Cultural Revolution. But it's extraordinary continuity as the Ming fathers say to their Qing teenagers, okay, I'm not going to go near these people anymore, but it's time for you to go off to Hangzhou, was one of the cities, and sit for the exams. And if you can pass them, the family will kind of start a new era of life. And again, there are similar cases, I think, with spouses or with the junior consorts, often translated as the concubines. There would have been large numbers of women folk in such a household. And how did you decide to accept a new normalcy for that family and maybe even continue having children yourself? So this kind of action and this kind of travel, it was wonderful that you had all this. This gave us this great panorama, because the people I studied somewhat in the late Ming were great travelers, and they would wander far and wide, and this was not very comfortable travel. Usually you'd be on foot or maybe on a wheelbarrow or in a sedan chair if you were very wealthy. But the sense of Chinese commonality, the sense of wanting to know how so-and-so was doing, I mean, you weren't still likely to get letters through, though very occasionally you could. But the best way was to get your transport, get some servants together, get enough food for 3 or 4 months and head off, and see who was still living and how they were doing. And so we can find in various memoirs and reminiscences of this time a kind of a new kind of bird's eye view of China on the move, as it were. And we were talking at lunch, and I suddenly thought of a different area, which is, I mentioned then, was the sort of the battlefield visit. Is there a literature or a painting of those who go back to see the battlefields of their childhood, as it were, or their youth? And the answer does seem to be yes. People were keeping, we'd now say, oral history alive, and would build and recreate the heroisms in their little village or cluster. When you see these mountains, if you think of trying to storm those mountains, even with paratroops, I mean, how would you do it? This is China's a rugged place, almost anywhere. I mean, though it looks nice and flat on the map, the amount of hills and mountains and defiles and torrents and ravines and so on, it's a difficult country. And just to say they conquered China in 2 years is an astounding thought, and it's also not quite accurate. There are pockets of control, as one would guess, with huge areas that were left blank in the middle. And that it was the Qing who ordered all Chinese men to shave their heads and grow the famous queue of hair, the pigtail of hair, which was seen as a symbol of this subservience in a way. But it became also a marker of various kinds of masculine pride and so on. You had to declare yourself through your reaction to the new conquering dynasty, but you could also in old age, you could still go into a monastery, and again, the amount of temples and so on in this is very striking. Sometimes maybe one could think of, or one does think of the Middle Ages in Europe, when retreat into a monastery was one of the dignified forms of retreat, and very creative historiographically and poetically, and indeed in terms of calligraphy and this kind of thing.
To add a footnote to that, in late 17th century portraits, informal portraits, that's to say not ancestor portraits of the kind that you all know, which were meant to be hung up on ritual occasions and in special ritual spaces, but informal portraits that you would commission, or somebody would commission to to show what you looked like and what you cared about. They're somewhat expressive. In late 17th century portraits, you do not see the pigtail. You will not see it. Right. It's not until the 18th century, and really quite far on in the 18th century, that the pigtail is actually shown. Not only that, but everybody in this hall is familiar with blue and white porcelain, Qing blue and white porcelain. You may have a piece of it somewhere in your house, and if you have a piece of it, or if you've seen a piece of it recently, there were probably figures in it. They did not have pigtails. All through the Qing dynasty, the figures on porcelain continued to be in the Ming, shown in the Ming style, which is absolutely astonishing. This denial of or refusal of the reality around. And we miss this because often in exhibitions we see court paintings. And of course because the court was a Manchu court, it insisted on the pigtail being shown.
Jonathan, I was struck by the fact that Huang Yo, as a young man, wanted to go back to the site of military engagements. Yeah. How much do we know about him as an individual? What do you think his motivation was? Was it a pilgrimage of remembrance of the Ming? Was it a loyalist act? Was it tourism? What was his motivation?
No, not exactly. I mean, there is a historian, Lin Struve, who's worked on this generation of man. They felt as if they had missed out, like a generation of people who came a little bit too late for the Second World War, and who grew up feeling that they were less male, less masculine than their fathers. And so they, and quite a number of them became great travelers. And as Professor Spence was just saying, travel was a dangerous activity. So in doing that, they knew they were putting themselves in harm's way, and it became a symbolic substitute for soldiering. Some of them took up arms and became soldiers, some became strategists, some became military strategists. But this idea of actually getting out there and putting their bodies in danger was very strong. And they were just obsessed with military exploits and the recent events.
One of the things that you may notice when you look at the catalog, this exhibition is a selection of paintings that was first exhibited in Hong Kong in 1975 at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And actually James Watt, who recently retired as chairman of the Asian Art Department here, was the curator of that exhibition. The show opened again, was reconstituted in this spring in the Hong Kong Museum of Art. They did a beautiful new catalog, and they called it Nobility and Virtue. And we felt that somehow nobility and virtue didn't quite tell the whole story, that this was an art, perhaps you can't call it protest art, but there was something edgy about it. There was something that, as Jonathan, you described, the gap between recognizing the authority of the Qing and recognizing its legitimacy, and that much of this art is a kind of voicing maybe a passive resistance or noticing this gap. So I wonder, Jason, in light of how we express dissent today, whether you think I've had a hard time when reporters ask me, show me the one that's about dissent. It's not so easy to point to something and say, there it is. Is that, are we seeing in that something of the quality of subtlety that the literati of China would be speaking to like-minded spirits? There'd be an understanding without actually a public confrontation. I think.
Well, I think when we talk about this dissent, or actually in this case, is many of these artists were recluses, even though they were either Buddhist monks or Taoists, whatever they were. They were not just ordinary monks, especially like Shi Tao or Bada and Hongren. These people, they were extremely well educated, and they were highly intellectual. But at the time of dynastic change, this is a great time of chaos. They were facing a decision-making time. I think they were all trained in the Confucian ideal, which promoted active role in public service. But at this particular time, whether you should step out to serve in the new government or in the new dynasty, or you should withdraw, this is not a simple question for yourself. It's a large question of moral principles. And so even though on the one hand, the Confucian teaching is to go out to serve, but at the same time, the Confucian teaching also has the other side. Is in a time of extreme chaos or disturbance or political changes, you should make sure whom you are serving, what you are supposed to do. So at this time, withdrawal seemed to be the more preferable choice. And so these people went into reclusion. And so one of the shelters for these people would be temples.
Yes.
And so you would not lose your head by withdrawal from the public service. On the other hand, I would say it's because of this change that created great art, because these people were extremely talented people. They turned their passion, their enthusiasm into art, so that created Shi Tao and Bada, all these people.
Dissent seems to me, again, a form of political action. I mean, you dissent in order to stimulate public discourse, and it assumes the idea of a public sphere. And to that degree, I'm not sure it's exactly the right word here, because there is no public sphere in the modern sense in late 17th century China. There are these semi-public, semi-private networks of connections between individuals, but there's no broadly shared public sphere. Also, for me personally, I find the word uncongenial because it is so tied to 20th century discussions of totalitarian regimes. To me, it's a Cold War idea that found its way into sinology and has survived as a relic of the Cold War in the pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
The museum just opened an exhibition called Infinite Jest, which is about caricature and its political dimension. And you get caricature, particularly in Buddhist art, where you see lohans portrayed in an almost grotesque manner. But I think caricature implies that it is a public sphere. And what this art does not have is that kind of public dimension. It was shared among a small group of people. So perhaps the art of dislocation and that expression that Jonathan Hay brought out so beautifully of mourning and living in this rusticated wilderness is perhaps a better way to see it, because I think dissent does imply, like caricature or like this use of satire, it requires a public forum, which really didn't exist, except perhaps in these woodblock prints that you introduced from Xiao Yunsong, and that certainly was a very powerful set of images.
And it did exist in the late Ming, right? I mean, just before the fall of the Ming, there were these extraordinary gatherings of hundreds and hundreds of activist intellectuals getting together for huge lectures, and this huge lectures and discussions. What will we do to save the country? We have this corrupt regime. How can we fix it? What can we do? And then this continued to some degree after 1644, but the Qing government saw how dangerous that was going to be and stamped it out as quickly as possible. There were very stringent regulations against gatherings.
Actually, I have a question for Professor Spence. For this conquest of the Qing dynasty, for me to see the so-called conquest is really the military takeover. Politically, you take over the entire country. But since when did the Chinese identify themselves with the dynasty, or since when did them begin to accept the Qing dynasty as legitimate rule? I think that's what would be the final conquest really in mind.
Right, I don't know if we can, I know the question is much debated now. Would there be any meaning at the time in the phrase, you know, the Qing are coming, sort of that? Do you see your past marshaled in these great dynastic blocks? In some ways, the answer is clearly yes. You use it to organize the past, and you use it to organize historiography and schools of thought and so on. But you don't, I think you don't invoke sort of patriotic loyalism to the Qing. You probably more evoke a kind of ethnic loyalty to the idea of Manchu-ness. I mean, there's a big debate on this now among professional historians. What exactly is your balance between the Manchus as military conquerors and as civilian collaborators, and the Manchu men and their families being scattered in garrisons across China. And then with a curious law, that one can see its logic, that they were not to have jobs in trade. They weren't to conduct ordinary businesses, and they were to have small land grants, but they were to be a kind of urban-based elite. And a younger scholar called Pamela Crossley, among others, has written movingly about this, and Mark Elliott, two younger scholars, trying to trace different ways in which this identity was instilled. And when did you call yourself a Manchu? You could actually, it's not exactly an ethnic label, because people could take it or drop it and so on. But you had very strong rules against intermarriage, from banners into the civil society in a general way. You had all sorts of markers by dress and custom and deportment and living arrangements and diet and religion and so on from Manchu people. Manchus, pure Manchus, if there is such a thing in here, would have been shamanistic. They would have had shamanistic religion, different belief system from most Chinese. And so the idea of the Da Qing, the great Qing, as a dynasty which is kind of a nationally controlling entity, some of these scholars would say that wouldn't really be accepted at all until perhaps the 19th century, that people wouldn't see that as a marker. But China's been a very flexible, you know, it's got smaller and larger and smaller and larger. And in the 18th century in China, it was a great period of expansion, territorially, politically, in which the idea of that as a Qing expansion rather than as a Chinese. Part of the question is, when do you call it Zhongguo? When do you call it the central country, or the Zhonghua, the central body of statecraft, you know? And then this again turns out to be late, I think. And even in the late 19th century, there was trouble in various protocol situations in the West, because Manchu China still didn't have a flag. People said, but you've got to have a flag. We're all flying the flag next week. The Chinese said, well, what flag? We don't want one. We don't have one. And the Westerners actually designed a Qing banner to be waved at ceremonial occasions. Yes, the dragon on the triangular flag. But so that it took a long time. And if we could end the story with a sort of another slightly melancholy note, but it's again a complex note down here. When the Qing, when the Qing were finally at their weakest, around about 1908 to 1910, 1911, and the dynasty collapsed in 1911 to 1912, it became. There was evidence all over China that many of the Manchu Qing rulers were truly hated. And people called this ethnic hatred, or a kind of a complex, enraged kind of feeling of having been let down by the Manchus, admittedly after 250 years. But nevertheless, a feeling that this country has somehow been betrayed. And just as the dynasty started, in a way, with this violence, and which led to some of these responses in poetry and art and so on that were so beautiful, so the dynasty closed in violence. Well, in many cases, whole towns, town garrison areas of Manchu women, children, and the soldiers were all killed. by crowds that we could call Chinese crowd, but they'd been told so many times how to separate themselves out, from the Qing, from the Manchu, that there was a very, very grim series of confrontations, and they didn't really stop for about a year and a half, 2 years, and then the Manchu people, as an identified sort of ethnic subgroup, vanishes really from the political structure and either goes back to ancestral homelands, which they've never seen before, in northern Manchuria, for instance, or made their peace with the Chinese, abandoned the Manchu label altogether and became part of a new political order. And I think now in this very complex balance is where we are. And the so-called peripheral areas are still ones that are difficult for the Chinese, whether Han or Zhongguo, the Chinese, that it's hard for them to be identified and controlled, so that China is constantly kept off balance by different elements within its own society.
So I think one of the roles that the Met can play is to explore the complexities of China's history and the complexities of China's identity. It's very clear that we cannot simplify or reduce China to a set of simple equations, but that there's a vast and complex and highly individualistic people that we're dealing with a great history, great awareness of that history. So I look forward to future exhibitions when we can continue to explore all of the rich resources of China's past and present. Thank you all very much.